Hey guys, so Seymour Skinner's Badass Song is the 19th episode of Season 5. It also happens to be the 100th episode ever of The Simpsons. So really this is going to be an interesting first episode to review. Now honestly, I remember this episode quite fondly, but I honestly can't recall me remembering this as the 100th episode. I do not think this is a bad thing, as I think it's important to judge the episode on its own merits and not judge it harshly just because it's held to a higher standard as it's the 100th episode. The episode first aired on April the 28th, 1994, and was directed by Bob Anderson and written by Oakley and Weinstein, who would later become the series' showrunners. The story mainly follows Bart indirectly getting Skinner fired and eventually, after establishing a non-hostile relationship with him, try to get him rehired. There also really is not a B-plot in this episode. You could argue that Ned Flanders becoming principal is somewhat of a B-plot, but we never really explore Flanders in this role without viewing it through Bart. So anyway, let's discuss the plot. The episode starts with two films of a younger Marge and Homer, with the Beatles song "A Little Help From My Friends" overlaid on the footage. I'm not sure why they decided to start with this. It gives the impression at first that the episode is going to be about Marge and Homer's past, but really both Marge and Homer are not present significantly in this episode at all. This is almost a theme of the episode, the theme being one's past. We see this with Marge and Homer's film, later with Bart as a baby, we get our first ever look at Ned's hippie parents, and we see a picture of Skinner in his Vietnam days, or at least in his military days. It's an odd choice to start the episode like this, but it's effective as it shifts to the show and tell dilemma that Bart has. Bart ends up, of course, bringing Santa's little helper to the school, and his entire class fall in love with the dog. My only critique of this scene is Willie peering through the window, especially as he's later the one to chase the dog through the air vents. Surely he'd recognise the dog when he's chasing him later on in the episode. It's possible that Willie did recognise him, but just didn't verbally communicate that to the audience. Santa's little helper makes it into the air vents, and this serves as the inciting incident for the story, as without Santa's little helper causing trouble in the air vents, we wouldn't have had the story with Bart and Skinner. We got this hilarious scene of Willie chasing him. I honestly think this segment is the strongest in the episode. It's full of great jokes, and it serves as a slight tension, especially for Skinner. Chalmers arrives, and at first it appears that the crisis has been avoided, but Chalmers did not make way for Willie, and Skinner is fired. This effectively acts as the first plot point for the episode and throws us into Act 2. At the school, Chalmers announces that there will be a new principal, and we get the debut of Leopold. One could argue that Flanders being made principal is a little random, but I would argue it works in the episode's favour greatly. The bait and switch with Leopold is rather good. I mean, sure, the episode could work if the principal who takes over is an aggressive tyrant-like figure, but you don't need that type to prove that the elementary needs Skinner. Bart meets Skinner at the laundromat, and the two begin to form this bond and friendship. It's telling that once you remove the school environment, these two get on like a house on fire. I especially love this subtle moment. I expected Bart to laugh when Skinner gets nipped, but no, Bart bats the crab away like a true friend. We get this really touching moment establishing the midpoint of the episode, where Skinner recalls his students' comments. I like the callback to Martin's Raisin Roundies. Nothing major, it was just a cool little callback. The reason I argue this is the midpoint is because at this point Skinner can't really feel worth and purpose with his mundane day-to-day life. He needs purpose, and he understands if he can't be principal, he has to return to his military past. Now this being the midpoint is slightly an issue because we are about 60 minutes into a 22-minute episode. We will get onto this in a bit. They don't waste time with Bart going to the military base and convincing Skinner to be principal again. This, I'd argue, is plot point 2, and we are shifted into the third and final act. The climax is obviously Bart trying to get Flanders fired and eventually succeeding to do so. But did anyone else think it was done way too easily and way too quickly? Because it really does. We get some social political commentary about public schools in America, and then Chalmers remarks that they'll all be like this eventually. And then Ned thanks the Lord on the loudspeaker, and Chalmers just cannot put up with this, declaring God has no place within these walls. Maybe Chalmers is a bit of an atheist, or at least he's very secular. Now that I think of it, there really isn't any major atheist characters in The Simpsons. At least I can't really think of any off the top of my head. After this, the episode closes off with Bart and Skinner having this last sweet moment before both leaving with signs on their backs. Great resolution. Like I said, I think the third act in this episode is the weakest. It feels way too easily solved. Skinner just has to make a pass at his commanding officer to get out of the military. Chalmers conveniently hears Ned on the loudspeaker. It's all solved way too easily. I guess ideally the third act would actually involve Skinner doing something. Well, I mean on screen. This mainly comes down to the sheer time that Act 1 takes up. Now don't get me wrong, Act 1 is perfect. It's funny, tense, and a joy to rewatch. But it is rather time consuming. As I said, I think the second act starts as soon as Skinner is fired, but that's 8 minutes in a 22-minute episode. It's nothing major, and if we want to be really conservative and strict, then Act 1 shouldn't go over 5 minutes and a half. But I think this is the main reason Act 3 seems quick and too easy. It simply doesn't have enough time. But overall, the plot is fairly well paced. It's only really Act 3 that feels underwhelming. Act 1 and 2 are full of snappy story beats and really funny jokes. Speaking of, I think this episode is really great at mixing emotional moments with hilarious jokes. I honestly don't think any of the jokes in this episode are inherently unfunny. Well, maybe this guilty conscious joke. I don't think it's bad, it's just a bit But even that one isn't unfunny. It's just not a good joke as some of the others. The first act is particularly strong. Willie is a killer in this respect. Make way for Willie and grease me up woman are easily two of the funniest moments. I also really like, are you calling me a liar joke? Something about it is just so heartbreaking but ironically funny when Skinner realises that he is fired. The episode is really great at subtle and less on-the-nose humour. For example, Bart cycling into the guarded Fort Springfield, or Skinner's apron. These aren't hilarious or anything, but I appreciate that the jokes aren't so in your face. I also really like the meta joke by Marge too. How would you like it if 20 years from now people are laughing at what you did? Real meta. And it's even more meta in 2020. I think I safely say the humour in this episode is pretty solid. There are a few jokes here and there that are kinda but for the most part the jokes are solid and really add flavour to the emotional rollercoaster of the story. There are other great jokes in this episode, but there really is too many to list. Anyway, let's move on to the characters. I think it's difficult to make the decision of who the true protagonist of the episode is. Sure, the episode starts with Bart and we follow Bart's guilt of causing Skinner to lose his job, but the story beats that move the story forward all involve Skinner. I mean, we couldn't have the no return point without Skinner deciding to join the military. Now if Bart convinced him to join the military or directly caused him to, then I'd hands down say the protagonist is Bart, but that's not the case. I think the best answer is that it's a dual protagonist episode. The story is driven forward by both Bart and Skinner, but the character who I think gets the most interesting new perspective on is Skinner. We really see how important his job is to him, and he's not doing it just for the power or to be some sort of asshole. He does it because he really cares. I honestly do think this makes the characters very sympathetic and relatable, especially when we view this new perspective through the lens of Bart, his mortal enemy. I do think we get a very solid view of Bart as well, but nothing too original. The guilty Bart story has definitely been done a million times by this point, and has been done in episodes previously to this one. So I'd say the real standout character in this episode is really Skinner. You could also argue that Flanders gets a little bit of a new perspective too, just from his flashback alone. We can really see how Ned became this ultra-religious type. I think him being principal wasn't really explored much, but obviously that would take up more of the main story, so I think the writers were right not to explore it. At the end of the episode, the status quo is re-established. Although Bart and Skinner had this understanding and friendship, they now must go back to being enemies. Now, normally I like character development and characters having some overarching arcs, but in this case, the status quo ending was needed. As Lisa says, Sherlock needs his Moriarty. Without Bart having his antagonist, then Bart is just not Bart anymore. So in terms of characters, I think this episode does a great job, especially with Seymour Skinner. So, do I think this episode is good or bad? Well, although I take issues with the pacing of Act 1 and 2, as it negatively affects Act 3, I still think that this is a very good episode. It delivers great jokes, has emotional moments, and generally this whole episode is solid and underpraised. In conclusion, I think the episode is a solid 8 out of 10. Now, let's move on to the random wheel. What episode are we doing next week? So I got a new wheel, so let's spin it. So the episode we're going to be reviewing next week is... Mo Goes from Rags to Riches.